the Red Army conducted its first successful summer offensive in 1943. The German army began a withdrawal, but the Red Army kept coming. Welcome to the history of the 20th century. Episode 408, The Great Retreat. In episodes 395 and 96, I told you about Operation Citadel, the unsuccessful German 1943 summer offensive, and then the successful Soviet counteroffensives. I ended by telling you of the Soviet recapture of Kharkov on August 23, 1943. That was the end of the episode, but it wasn't the end of the Soviet offensive. The Red Army continued to apply pressure to the German army for several more weeks, harrying it as the Germans retreated. I want to begin today by focusing on the Donbass, the Donetsk Basin, roughly the region from Kharkov south to the Sea of Azov. The Donbass represents eastern Ukraine, and it was a region Hitler valued for its coal mines and industry. He impressed upon his commanders repeatedly that the Donbass was too valuable to surrender and must be held at all costs. Even as Red Army units farther north began their advance on Kharkov, here the Red Army attempted to push the Germans out of the Donbass. Hitler reluctantly approved the movement of reinforcements to this sector of the front to reinforce the German line. I say reluctantly because they were just as badly needed farther north to defend Kharkov, but he chose to make the Donbass a higher priority. With the aid of these reinforcements, and with the support of the Luftwaffe, the Germans were able to turn the tide. They encircled and captured 5 Red Army divisions and pushed the Soviet side back to the starting line. Soviet losses were heavy. It was a German victory, a victory of the sort that reminded one of the glory days of 1941, when the Germans achieved this kind of victory over and over, though the deployment of German reinforcements here contributed to the loss of Kharkov. Still, a win is a win, right? But less than 2 weeks later, the Red Army began a second offensive in the same region. Again, Hitler insisted on holding the line, but after 2 weeks, an entire German infantry corps was in danger of being surrounded. Hitler had no choice but to give permission to withdraw. Back in early 1943, in the aftermath of the debacle at Stalingrad, senior German army commanders, and especially Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, began recommending to Hitler the construction of a defensive line in the Western Soviet Union, from the Baltic to the Sea of Azov. Hitler rejected the idea with his usual argument, which was that to build a defensive line behind the front would tempt frontline soldiers to withdraw into its defenses. But in August, as the Battle of Kursk turned against Germany, Hitler reversed his decision and approved the construction of what the Germans called Ostwall, the Eastern Wall. At the time of his approval, the front line was hundreds of kilometers east of the proposed defensive line. In the southern portion of the front, Ostwall would take advantage of the Dnieper River. Like other rivers in this region, its west bank rose steeply from the river valley, making it an excellent place for a defensive line. Farther south, though, the Dnieper takes a sharp turn to the west before emptying into the Black Sea. To fall back this far would be to surrender the Crimea, so the planned Ostwall line would diverge from the river at that bend and continue to the south and east to the Sea of Azov. This would keep the land bridge to the Crimea safely in German hands. But by late August, the Red Army's Central Front had opened a gap in the German line between Army Group Center and Army Group South. On September 3rd, with Sicily securely in Allied hands and the first Allied units landing on the Italian mainland, Günther von Kluge, commander of Army Group Center, and Erich von Manstein, commander of Army Group South, suggested to Hitler that a single commander-in-chief be appointed for the Eastern Front, someone who would have full authority to direct Wehrmacht operations in the East. Ever since the Allies landed in Sicily, most of Hitler's attention had been focused on the Mediterranean, but the Eastern Front needed a full-time commander to coordinate the many German forces deployed there. No doubt Manstein had himself in mind for this position, but it was a moot point as the Führer refused to consider it. He ordered Manstein to hold the Donbass region at all costs. 2 days later, the Red Army marched into the industrial city of Stalino, the largest town in the Donbass. In our time, it is known as Donetsk, and it lies within the borders of Ukraine, although Vladimir Putin claims it and the surrounding region for Russia. Army Group South was in full retreat. 3 days later, on September 8th, Manstein sent Hitler a message advising that Army Group South was unable to contain the advancing Red Army forces in the Donbass. Hitler flew to Manstein's headquarters at Zaporozhye to discuss the situation face to face. Manstein's report was so grim, Hitler agreed to permit Manstein's forces to withdraw to Ostwall. But construction work on Ostwall had barely begun. After their meeting, Hitler flew back to the Wolf's Lair. This meeting marks the last time Hitler would set foot on occupied Soviet territory. To the Führer, the most painful part of this withdrawal was that Army Group A would also have to withdraw from the Taman Peninsula. This is the peninsula in the western Caucasus that points toward the Crimea. The gap between the two peninsulas forms the passage from the Black Sea to the Sea of Azov. So long as Army Group A held that bridgehead, it represented at least the possibility of another German offensive into the Caucasus. Ordering Army Group A to pull back into the Crimea was a tacit admission that that offensive was never going to happen. But the Germans had bigger problems than the Taman Peninsula. The Red Army, now equipped with many more tanks and vehicles, was much more mobile by 1943, and the vast steppes of the region allowed for rapid advance. As the Germans withdrew, the Red Army followed, harassing their retreat, nipping at their heels, so to speak. Hitler ordered a scorched earth withdrawal, which for the German army mostly meant that any arms, ammunition, or supplies that they couldn't take with them had to be destroyed. At the southern end of the line, where the Dnieper bends westward, Ostwall splits off from the river to defend the land bridge to Crimea. On September 10th, the Red Army's southern front entered Mariupol on the Sea of Azov. Less than 2 weeks later, they reached the city of Melitopol, where the Germans meant to anchor the southern line of Ostwall. Ostwall was nowhere near complete, but the Germans had built 4 defensive lines of anti-tank ditches interspersed with landmines. Here the southern front advance came to a halt. The Germans fought fiercely for Melitopol in a battle that lasted 6 weeks. Farther north, lead elements of the Soviet 3rd Tank Army actually reached the German defensive line at the Dnieper, such as it was, before the Germans did, also on September 22nd. Stalin promised the first soldier to cross the Dnieper would be made a hero of the Soviet Union, the USSR's highest honor. Red Army soldiers on the east bank of the river accepted the challenge. They tried crossing on small boats, on wooden gates transformed into makeshift rafts, on empty oil barrels, or on waterproof tarpaulins stuffed with hay, or even by swimming. 4 Red Army soldiers ultimately did get those Hero of the Soviet Union medals they were promised, but many others weren't so lucky. The Germans still enjoyed the advantage of the high West Bank that overlooked the river and made it easy to pick off the Soviet soldiers who attempted to cross. On the other hand, German units were fragmented and disorganized. Some Red Army soldiers discovered undefended crossing points where they were able to reach the West Bank with relative ease. They scored their biggest success north of Kiev, where Red Army units crossed the Dnieper into the Pripyat marshes. The Germans had not stationed much of a force here because they believed the marshes to be impassable. The Red Army not only advanced into the marshes, they sent in the 5th Guards Tank Corps. Lots of T-34s got stuck in the swamp, but a lot of others managed to make it through. By the time the Germans had completed their withdrawal across the river, there were already numerous small bridgeheads held by Soviet troops on the West Bank. Most of these bridgeheads were no more than a few kilometers wide and a kilometer or so deep, and the soldiers who crossed had not been able to bring any heavy equipment with them. The Germans fought to recapture those bridgeheads and force the enemy soldiers back across the river. The Red Army fought to hold and expand their bridgeheads. It was touch and go. The Red Army commanders scrambled to assemble paratroops for an airborne assault on the west bank of the river that they hoped would secure the Soviet position. They managed to scrape together 2 brigades worth of paratroops, most of whom had never yet dropped from an actual airplane. On the evening of September 24th, just under 5,000 Soviet paratroopers landed. Unfortunately for them, bad weather earlier that afternoon had concealed the redeployment of the 19th Panzer Division to their drop site. About 1,000 of the Soviet paratroops were killed or captured. Most of the rest had all they could manage just staying away from the Germans and ended up dispersed into woodlands and joining up with the partisans. Only about 200 were able to link up with Red Army units already on the West Bank. This was the Red Army's second and last major airborne operation of the war. The previous one had been in the winter of 1941, an attempt to land soldiers in the German rear and disrupt their supply lines during the Soviet winter offensive. That operation ended badly, like this one, and the 2 defeats convinced Stavka not to attempt any further such operations. The disappointment of the failed airborne assault was mitigated somewhat on the next day, September 25th, when, farther north, advancing Red Army units liberated the city of Smolensk, which had fallen to the Germans in July 1941, just 3 weeks into Operation Barbarossa, and after 3 Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Over time, the Red Army was able to bring up heavy artillery and Katyushas to bombard the Germans on the opposite bank, forcing the Germans to hunker down and disrupting their attacks on the bridgeheads. Partisans in the German rear conducted sabotage operations to block German resupply and reinforcement. In the end, Soviet soldiers were able to hold most of the bridgeheads despite heavy casualties. By mid-October, the Soviets held 2 bridgeheads more than 50 kilometers wide on the west bank of the Dnieper, one north of Kiev, which is located on the Dnieper, the other south of Kiev. In early November, the Red Army began offensives from both bridgeheads, leaving the Germans no choice but to withdraw from the city, which was liberated on November 6th, one day before the 26th anniversary of the October Revolution. Stalin couldn't have been happier. Not only was the timing just right to celebrate the liberation of Kiev as part of the anniversary ceremonies, but these key victories would give him a stronger negotiating position when he met with Churchill and Roosevelt in Tehran later that same month. The recapture of Kiev allowed Soviet authorities to examine Babi Yar, the site of German mass killings, and confirm the rumors. I told you about the events of late September 1941, when the SS led a massacre of more than 33,000 Jewish citizens of Kiev in just 2 days. During the 2 years that followed, the Germans continued to use the site to conduct mass executions of Jews, Roma, and communists. No one knows for sure how many people were murdered there altogether, but the number is somewhere around 100,000. As the Red Army advanced, the Germans had made an effort to exhume the bodies and burn them to destroy the evidence of these crimes, but there were too many bodies and not enough time. Soviet journalist Vasily Grossman, at the scene following the liberation, struggled to find the words to describe the magnitude of the horror he observed. Don't we all? Here is some of what he wrote. This was the murder of a great and ancient professional experience, passed from one generation to another in thousands of families of craftsmen and members of the intelligentsia. This was the murder of everyday traditions that grandfathers passed on to their grandchildren. This was the murder of memories, of a mournful song, folk poetry, of life, happy and bitter. This was the destruction of hearths and cemeteries. This was the death of a nation which had been living side by side with Ukrainians for hundreds of years. A day before the liberation of Kiev, November 5th, and 500 kilometers to the south, the Red Army captured Melitopol after 6 weeks of heavy combat and broke through Ostval. November 7th, 1943 was the 26th anniversary of the October Revolution. You'll recall that the Soviet government and military defiantly held a military parade in Moscow during the 1941 anniversary, when the Wehrmacht was less than 150 kilometers from the capital. But there was no parade in 1942 or 1943. There would not be another one until 1946. There was no parade, but Stalin issued an order of the day praising the Red Army and pointing out that it had recovered 2/3 of the Soviet territory seized by the Germans. He praised the Allies for their efforts in North Africa and Italy, and the Allied bombing campaign over Germany, and predicted that the forces of what the Soviet government liked to call the anti-Hitlerite coalition would lead to the crushing of the military might of Hitlerite Germany and complete Allied victory. The following day, November 8th, was the 20th anniversary of the Munich Putsch of 1923. Despite the deteriorating German position on the Eastern Front, Hitler made a last-minute decision to travel to Munich and address the old fighters. No one yet knew it, but this would be the last time he appeared at one of these anniversary dinners, and one of the last public addresses he would ever make. In his speech, he dismissed the Allied invasion of Italy, noting the enemy had been beaten to a standstill far south of Rome, and promising that any Allied attempt to land in Western Europe would similarly grind to an ignominious halt. He pledged that German cities bombed by the Allies would be rebuilt to become more beautiful than ever, his words, and the hour of payback for these attacks was close at hand. As for the situation on the Eastern Front, he dismissed recent Soviet gains as insignificant. What did a few hundred kilometers here or there matter, so long as the fighting remained far from German territory? And he concluded by repeating his pledge, or was it a threat, that unlike 1918, when Germany laid down its arms at 11:45, this time the nation would never surrender. The Battle of Stalingrad had been the psychological turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, but the Battle of Kursk was the military turning point. In 1941, the Soviet government blamed the disaster of Operation Barbarossa on German treachery. Germany and the USSR had had a peace treaty, which the Germans brazenly violated with a massive surprise attack. It was no wonder that the Soviet Union was caught off guard. In those dark days, you didn't hear much from the government about the brilliance of Comrade Stalin. What you heard were appeals to defend Mother Russia, appeals that would not have been out of place in the Imperial Russia of 1916. The Red Army began its first successful counterattack that winter. The Russians knew how to survive a Russian winter, the Germans did not. Indeed, you'll recall that the German army had been underprepared for winter on Hitler's orders. He figured sending winter coats to the front line sent the wrong message. The war was supposed to have ended in another German triumph before those coats would be needed. The Soviet counteroffensive might have cost the Germans even more dearly and pushed their lines farther west, were it not for the sad state of the Soviet economy, and especially Soviet arms production, due to the disruption of the German invasion. The Soviet setbacks of 1942 were a little harder to explain. By August 1942, the Germans had advanced as far as the Caucasus and the Volga. Again, the government made appeals in the name of Mother Russia. Then came the Battle of Stalingrad and the liberation of Kharkov and Kursk. Soviet morale soared. The Soviet government and the Red Army awaited the 1943 German offensive with a certain amount of trepidation, but when it came, it was turned back easily enough. Then the Red Army went on its first summer offensive of the war and pushed the invaders all the way back to the Dnieper. No longer heard were calls to defend Mother Russia. Now you heard about the triumph of the Soviet state and the party, and above all, of the genius of Comrade Stalin. And the Soviet Union became more confident than ever of victory. Stalin's relations with the Western Allies changed. Before, there were tensions over the discovery of the Katyn massacre and Stalin's endless carping about opening a second front, matched only by his disdain for the North African campaign. Operation Husky had been dismissed as the invasion of some island in the Mediterranean. On the other hand, there was also the decision to shut down Comintern, meant as an olive branch to the Western capitalists. Then came the Battle of Kursk and the fall of Mussolini. Soviet propaganda stopped criticizing the capitalists, substituting instead the word imperialists. Even the October Revolution was described as a victory over imperialism. The fall of Mussolini was celebrated in the Soviet press as an Anglo-American triumph. Moscow even began publicly praising American Lend-Lease aid. September 1943 saw a revival of the Russian Orthodox Church and the coronation of a new Patriarch of Moscow. The Soviet state remained officially atheist, but the church would be permitted to resume worship services, and priests would be released from prison. The new policy of tolerance of the Orthodox Church helped relations with the Western Allies, which were urging the USSR to move in that direction. Also, most Soviet citizens were still religious. There was no prohibition against religious belief, so reconciliation with the church helped bolster national unity. There was also a pragmatic reason. The Germans had reopened churches in the lands they'd occupied as a way of garnering local support. It would be rather awkward if, when the liberators came, one of their first steps was to shut the churches down again. August 1943 saw the introduction of a new Soviet heavy tank to replace the old KVs. The KV-1 heavy tank had been a problem for the Germans in 1941, But by 1943, it was no match for the new German Tiger heavy tanks. The Soviets quickly designed and began manufacturing a replacement designated IS-1. The IS is a romanization of the Cyrillic letters that represent the initials of Joseph Stalin. The IS-1 was a stopgap model produced until the improved IS-2 could enter the war in October 1943. The IS-2 bore a 122mm cannon that could knock out a German Tiger at a range of 1 kilometer and could absorb a direct hit from one of those dreaded German 88s. Stalin was very pleased with the tank that bore his initials and predicted it would win the war for the USSR. By that October, the Red Army was marching from victory to victory, and Moscow was firing salutes to liberated cities practically every day. Stalin and the Soviet leadership gradually realized that a Soviet victory was no longer a matter of if, it was a matter of when. With this realization came an acceptance that the timing of the Western Allies' Operation Overlord was no longer so critical to the Soviet Union. The leadership continued to hold the cynical view that, yes, the Western Allies did want to defeat Germany and end the war, but they were in no hurry so long as it was Russians doing most of the fighting and dying. This was not to say that the alliance with the US and UK was worthless. The Western Allies were still sending ever-increasing quantities of Lend-Lease aid, and even Stalin had to admit that the mere threat of a Western Allied invasion was forcing Hitler to garrison France with some 25 divisions, with another 12 engaged on the Italian front, forces that otherwise would have been fighting the Red Army. The Soviets largely blamed Winston Churchill for the delayed invasion of France. It was well understood in Moscow that the Americans were eager to get their soldiers onto French soil as soon as possible, while it was Churchill dragging his feet and talking about invading Greece or Norway instead. In mid-October, the UK Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, and the American Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, came to Moscow to meet with Molotov and lay the groundwork for the upcoming meeting of the Big Three in Tehran. Fu Pingsheng, the Chinese ambassador in Moscow, would represent China. The Tehran Conference would be the first face-to-face meeting of all three leaders of the major Allied powers. Churchill had met with Stalin twice before in Moscow. Roosevelt and Stalin had never met. As you know, Stalin had declined previous invitations to summit meetings outside Soviet borders. Stalin did not like to travel, and especially not in airplanes. There were also security questions, and the fact that Stalin commanded the Red Army and could not afford to leave Moscow for very long. And behind all these concerns was the matter of prestige. The Soviet view was that the USSR was carrying most of the burden of the war. Comrade Stalin should not be made to appear at someone else's capital like a supplicant seeking aid from his lord. Stalin wouldn't even allow Molotov to meet with his foreign counterparts anywhere but Moscow. Apart from those concerns, Stalin did not feel any urgency about meeting with Roosevelt and Churchill, especially not so long as the promised Operation Overlord kept getting delayed and the fighting on the Eastern Front seemed endless. After the Battle of Kursk, though, things had changed. With the end of the war now in sight, there was a purpose to discussing military coordination with the Western Allies in order to end the war as quickly as feasible. In fact, now that the Red Army was advancing, there were those in Stalin's government who suggested that the delay in Operation Overlord into 1944 was not necessarily a bad thing, and might even benefit the USSR. Let the Germans spend one more winter freezing in Russia, and let the British and Americans continue to bomb their cities and factories. Then, next year, let the Red Army advance right up to the German border. Then would be the time for Operation Overlord. Otherwise, if the British and Americans landed in Europe too soon, the Germans might surrender to them and allow them to occupy their country. Where would that leave the Soviet Union after many years of struggle and sacrifice? The Conference of Foreign Ministers went on for 12 days, and everyone got on rather well. The British brought stereoscopic photographs taken by the RAF of the results of their bombing raids over German cities. Stalin could look through the lenses and peer down on the ruins of a German city, viewing it like a vengeful god in 3 dimensions. He loved it. He told Eden, "Hit the bastards hard, the harder the better," as he pounded the table for emphasis. Stalin wanted the Western Allies to commit to a date for Operation Overlord. The Americans wanted a Soviet commitment to enter the war against Japan after Germany was defeated. They also wanted the USSR to agree to American air bases on Soviet territory, which would allow for American bombers to reach targets in Eastern Europe via shuttle bombing. The Soviets were not enthusiastic about that. Then there was the thorny issue of post-war Poland, and talk of getting Turkey and Sweden to join the Allies. It was agreed all these questions would be on the agenda in Tehran. The American delegation in particular left Moscow impressed with Stalin's grasp of military matters. It may have helped their impression that he was usually on their side in the debate with the British. This conference was meant to set the table for the Tehran Conference, but it produced some important results on its own. The 3 foreign secretaries signed a declaration on Italy, calling for the eradication of fascism and a return to democracy in that country, to be overseen by a commission that would include representatives from the US, the UK, the USSR, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. They also signed a declaration on Austria, which called for a free and independent Austria after the war, and warned the Austrians that how the Allies treated their country would depend in part on a show of resistance against Hitler and the German government. A third declaration, pushed by the British, noted the evidence of mass killings and other atrocities in German-occupied territories, and proclaimed that after the war, the perpetrators should be delivered to the nations where these crimes occurred to be tried by courts in those countries. You may recall that after the last war, the Allies left it to the Germans to try their own war criminals, and nothing much came of that. Finally, the Americans pushed for a 4th declaration, to be signed not only by the 3 foreign ministers, but by Ambassador Fu as well, representing China, in accordance with the American desire for China to be included as a peer of the Big Three. The British went along with this with some reluctance. The Soviets were eager to please the Americans, and it seemed no longer quite so frightened of the Japanese. They signed on as well. The resolution laid the groundwork for the post-war United Nations. The meeting ended with smiles all around, and as I noted before, when the anniversary of the October Revolution arrived a week later, Stalin praised the efforts of the Western Allies. He was also pleased about Italy quitting the war, and predicted that Germany's other European allies would soon follow suit. Otherwise, Stalin predicted, only bumps and bruises were now in store for them. We'll have to stop there for today. I thank you for listening, and I'd like to thank Linda, Ayun, and Leon for their kind donations, and thank you to Joshua for becoming a patron of the podcast. Donors and patrons like Linda, Ayun, Leon, and Joshua help cover the costs of making this show, which in turn keeps the podcast available free for everyone always. So my thanks to them and to all of you who have pitched in and helped out. If you'd like to become a patron or make a donation, you are most welcome. Just visit the website historyofthe20thcentury.com and click on the PayPal or Patreon buttons. And as always, the podcast website contains notes about the music used on the podcast. If you hear a piece of music on the podcast and you would like to know more about it, including the composer, the performers, and a link to where you could download it, that would be the place to go. While you're there, you can leave a comment and let me know what you thought about today's show. Next month, I plan to be at both ReaderCon in Boston and then Confluence in Pittsburgh, so if any of you happen to be attending either of those conventions, do look me up and say hi. And I hope you'll join me next week here on the History of the 20th Century. I don't know about you, but I think it's time for another break from the horrors of war. So let's go back to Hollywood and look at the number 2 studio of the period, Paramount Pictures. Famous players in famous plays, next week, here on the History of the 20th Century. Oh, and one more thing. The German defensive line, Ostwall, never amounted to much, but its name presumably was coined by analogy to Westwall, which is what the Germans called their pre-war fortifications along the border with France. Westwall never amounted to much either, although Nazi propaganda made a big deal out of it. After France fell, Westwall was abandoned. Then, after the United States entered the war, Hitler ordered the construction of fortifications up and down the Atlantic coast of occupied Europe, from the Spanish border, along the French coast to Belgium, and then along the coasts of Belgium and the Netherlands, the Atlantic coasts of Germany and Denmark, and the coastline of Norway. Some elements from Westwall were removed and repurposed for this new coastal defensive line, which of course was dubbed Atlantikwall. Again, Nazi propaganda made a bigger deal out of Atlantikwall than it really was.